Following Germany's defeat in World War I, the country went from an authoritarian-style government with a large army and the Kaiser at the head of the nation to one which was democratically elected, with a president who the people voted for, as a result of the various reforms and revolutions in October and November of 1918. However, this was by no means everyone in the country, and there were still many people on the traditional conservative right wing, both nationalists and monarchists, who wanted a change. But who were these people, and what did they do, and if so, when did they do it, and why don't we know more about it? The traditional elements of German society in 1918 and 1919 would be the sort of conservative right-wing areas of the people. So for instance, people in the army, especially the higher up echelons of the army, there is an important distinction to make between them and the lower class men in the army and the navy. For example, people who supported the Kaiser, so these were called monarchists, because obviously the Kaiser, Wilhelm II in this case, had been the emperor of Germany during and before the First World War. And of course also people from the middle classes, called der Mittelstand at the time in Germany, as well as people of the upper classes, conservatives. So these were generally the people who were more in favour of an authoritarian style government in the right-wing traditional sense of the Old Reich. However, of course, during 1918, they had the October reforms followed by the November Revolution, which led to the increased power and importance of the working classes in Germany, with the election of parties like the SPD, the Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschland, the Social Democrats of Germany, and of course the President Hilbert was a member of this party, as well as people who were more on the left, so the USPD, the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, who was essentially communist, and the KPD, who was of course the Communist Party of Germany, as well as people who were lower down in the army. Of course, the army and the navy, the sailors, all formed councils or Soviets during 1918, and although Germany didn't go full communist, they did try at some points during the Spartacist Rising, for instance. So that's a little bit of background. Now, of course, the Treaty of Versailles, which was an incredibly important treaty at the time and was essentially the prolonged peace at the end of the First World War after the armistice was signed in November, it laid out that the Germans would have to pay huge amounts of money and that they would lose a lot of land. For instance, Open and Malmedy were lost to Belgium. Then you had a lot of land in the east. Pretty much all of Poland was taken from Germany, as well as the Alsace region, which is on the border with France, and other areas as well. However, one of the things that had to be done for the Treaty of Versailles, if the nations went to invade Germany and just split Germany between the various powers, was the reduction of the army. Now, of course, the army had been a huge part of the authoritarian German state before the war, but they now had to reduce the army down to simply 100,000 men, which was a really small amount when considering at the start of 1919, after months of demobilization, the German army still consisted of 350,000 men, as well as 250,000 men who were part of Freikorps. Now, Freikorps in German means Freikorps, and these free corps of men were essentially veterans who were recruited into unofficial armed units, which were the Freikorps. And the reason they did this was, one, because 100,000 men really isn't enough, especially for a big country like Germany, so a lot of the politicians wanted to make smaller units, because, of course, there was still a lot of communist activity in Germany at the time, and they weren't sure that their army could be relied upon to defeat the communists. And actually during the Spartacist uprising, as well as a few other communist uprisings that I'm going to make videos about in the future, it wasn't the army that was sent in against them, it was the Freikorps. However, because they weren't a part of the army, they were very unruly, they sort of governed themselves. They were of course very right-wing, mostly made up of World War I veterans, and they didn't have the kind of discipline that was required of an army, and they felt absolutely no moral qualms at killing civilians or anyone suspected of being, slightly more left than Hindenburg, which is a kind of an issue when you're using them to police the nation. So what sets off what I'm going to talk about in this video is actually when they tried to disband two of these units. And these two units were already Freikorps units, of course, but they were a special type of Freikorps because they had been fighting, at least one of them, in the Baltic, a lot of these people. Now, it's very interesting what happens after World War I. All these empires and governments start to fall. So obviously the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell, the Ottoman Empire fell, obviously the German Empire fell, as well as the Russian Empire. So then you suddenly get all these nationalistic movements in the Balkan, and as well in Eastern Europe start to rise up. Of course, Poland becomes a nation, and you have a lot of the nations further up that also become nations. So you had in Latvia a civil war between, on the one hand, Bolsheviks, so hardline communists, and on the other, the more traditional elements. And actually, these people were called the Baltikur, who fought against them, and a lot of these were actually Germans. And they came back after the civil war in Latvia and joined one of these brigades of Freikorps. One was called the Lohenfeld Brigade, and the other was called the Brigade Erhard, after their commander, who was also called Erhard. Now, they were forced to disband, and I think it was about 12,000 men in both of these, so these were, large brigades of men. However, they actually refused to do so, and the army didn't really insist on this very much, because the commander at the time of these units was a man called Walter von Ludwig. Von Ludwig had been a commander on the Western Front, as had pretty much all the commanders who I'm going to mention, because obviously this was straight after World War I. And instead what they did was they planned a coup, which the German word for coup is Putsch, and they planned to take over the Weimar government. On the 13th of March, the two brigades, the Lohenfeld and the Erhard brigades, both marched into Germany. And this is the start of what became known as the Kapp Putsch, because there was another man named Wolfgang Kapp, who was a civil servant and also a member of the army, who was also involved, and it became named after him, although it's also sometimes called the Kapp Ludwigs Putsch, because obviously those were the two important figures during the fight. Now, of course, you might think, well, hold on a minute, why doesn't the army step in? This is a coup attempt, so surely there is some element in the army that fights them. But actually, when these two brigades came to Berlin, they marched up, and the government sent in a general called von Seeckt. And von Seeckt and his men lined up, and it looked like they were about to do battle with these two troops of renegade Freikorps. But in the end, nothing actually happened. They didn't fire on them. Now, they actually said, and he is quoted as saying, Reichswehr schießt nicht auf Reichswehr, which means Reichstroops do not fire on Reichstroops. And you have to see this in a couple of ways. Either one, he wanted the Kapp Putsch to succeed. Two, he was unwilling to let troops who had literally a few years before fought side by side on both the Eastern and the Western Front against the Allies. He didn't want them to shoot each other. Of course, Germans shooting Germans was a big deal. Or, another interpretation is that these two brigades, the Marinebrigade, for instance, these were elite Freikorps brigades. They'd fought in Latvia, and therefore they were very elite and well trained, whereas the troops under von Seeckt were fairly new troops. They were green, so there is the question of whether they could have actually put up a decent resistance. But in any case, what's important to know is that they didn't, and this is the start of the putsch. They enter Berlin unopposed. Now, the Weimar government actually 15 minutes before the arrival of the rebel troops flees Berlin and flees to Dresden. But in Dresden, the commander there had been ordered to take them into custody and to take them back to Berlin. So they have to flee again, this time to Stuttgart, where they form a government in exile. Now, during this time, and something that I need to make a video about in Bavaria, which is this region that I have highlighted on the map, there had actually been a socialist uprising, at which point the People's Republic of Bavaria had been declared. Now, during this time, during the Kapp Putsch, they actually sent in the Freikorps into this area and quelled it with a huge amount of violence. And this will be important later on. Now, while in Stuttgart, Hilbert sets up the government in exile, as I mentioned, and he broadcasts to the people of Germany to start on a general strike to try and cripple this new putsch that had taken on, because obviously he couldn't trust the army, as he'd seen with General von Seeckt. He didn't do anything to stop the putsch when these rebellious troops came to Berlin. However, the people do come out on strike. Of course, the left-wingers in the country, which was a huge group of people, especially the working, the lower classes, that kind of thing, all came out on strike. They refused to work. None of the services were working. Transport, food, industry, agriculture, etc. all came to a complete stop. So they actually had to go down to sending out couriers on horseback because none of the communications lines were working. And slowly but surely this destroyed the new government that the putschists, or the rebels, were trying to set up. And on the 17th of March 1920 it actually completely fell apart. Now, the leaders of the putsch fled either to Hungary or to Germany, and the Weimar government was reinstated. However, on the last day, there was a lot of fighting between the putschists and people actually from the Marinebrigade Löwenfeld fired into the crowd, killing quite a lot of civilians. So, at the end of the day, the Weimar government had been restored. Hilbert was back in power, and the putschists had been defeated. However, this did have huge impacts in the political scene, because while before the Kapp Putsch, the SPD had retained a majority against other parties like the far right and the far left, after this, the SPD lost their majority for good. Now, it wasn't only two parties on the far left, so communists, and parties on the far right. So first of all, nationalists, monarchists, and later on, obviously, the NSDAP, the National Deutsches Arbeitspartei, so the Nazis, who they later became known as. Also, other centrist parties like Centrum, who were Catholic, and the DDP, the BVP, things like that. But this was the turning point that would turn essentially the Republic against itself. Now, after this, you get a period that's often referred to from 1924 to 1928 as the Golden Age of Weimar, but these far-right parties never go away. And it's also the case that the SPD never again gains a majority because the people felt that they had really failed. Of course, they had come back to power, which on the surface of things seems like they did very well to survive such a putsch attempt. However, it showed that the army was against them. Also, the fact that they were very lenient towards the people in the putsch. Actually, hardly any of them were punished. They were only really forced to resign from their positions. Important figures like Ludwig and Kapp. However, when there were communist uprisings in Ruhr, for example, which I will make a video about, these were treated very, very badly in comparison, and the people felt that this was a clear sign that the Weimar government was both against them and ineffective, essentially just being ruled by the right-wing conservatives who they thought they had overcome during the November Revolution in 1918. And of course, this then led to the kind of nationalist sentiment in Germany that would essentially lead to the Nazi Party's election in 1933. And you see a lot of the people on the far right start to become disillusioned with trying to regain control on a nationalist monarchist platform. And of course, the Nazis were special because they were the nationalist socialists. So they had a sort of different brand of this extreme right-wing kind of viewpoint. And it's only 4 years or 3 years after the Kapp Putsch that the Nazis will try to take power for themselves. But if you want to know about that, you'll just have to keep watching this series on the Weimar Republic, where I'll be sure to cover that in a video very soon. Alright everyone, so thank you very much for watching. This has been my video on the Kapp Putsch of 1920, which occurred obviously in March, mostly in Berlin, but also throughout Germany in areas where people went on strike. So I do hope you have enjoyed this video. Of course, if you are new and you thought it was interesting, please do make sure to smash that subscribe button. I would very much appreciate the support. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and ask anything you want in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. I'm History with Hilbert, and I'll see you all again very soon.